questions too, so any audio that we have later. All right, so the first thing that we're going to show here tonight is WinSCP. So this is the screen for WinSCP here. And so what you need to do to make use of WinSCP so you can access the files on the BCIT network is you have to put in when WinSCP opens. So you're going to choose SFTP as the protocol for transfer. And then the host name is files.bcit.ca. Put in your BCIT username and password. And then down below here, I think there should be save somewhere. I'm not sure it's manage. One of these things here will allow you to save this information. So that's the files.bcit.ca and your BCIT username and password, and to save it as a new site here, which I'm calling BCIT. So if you want to get this set up, this will allow you to download the session files from the BCIT server. So this is how it looks. So once you've logged in, you will see the BCIT network. Now it's a slightly different display than, of course, if you're sitting at a desk in the BCIT classrooms. So what, excuse me, what you're seeing on the left is a view of the contents of your computer. And then on the right is the BCIT network. Now, up on the top of the interface here, you can switch between the share in and share out. So of course, to get access to tonight's share out files, go into the share out folder and then scroll down to BLDG. Double click on BLDG and go down to 2805. Double click, and here's our share out folder for tonight. So now what you'll be able to do is to simply drag and drop session 11 onto your desktop maybe, and then later you can maybe move those files somewhere else. So here you can see all the files from the session 11 folder are being copied to my desktop. So it's going to take a few more seconds here for those files to come down. Now, if you folks have a question, like I said, feel free to use the chat window to ask any questions that you might have. I'll be monitoring the chat here. I've got two monitors going, so I can keep an eye on the chat while we proceed tonight. So we will take a couple of 10-minute breaks, and then we should try to be done hopefully around 9 or 9:15. Now, if you folks have the PDF that I sent you with tonight's notes, I emailed them a few minutes ago. What I'm also going to do here is attach the notes into our chat for tonight. So I attached the notes a little earlier. I'm just going to do it one more time here. Okay, so in your chat window, you will find another copy of tonight's notes. All right, so we're going to begin the session in earnest here. And tonight we're talking about renderings and walkthroughs. And what I really want to focus on is how we can make a really exceptional rendering in Revit. If we look at some of the work that's been done in Revit to date, So if we look at just Googling Revit renderings and seeing what we see, some of the renderings out there are they're pretty good, and other ones are, admittedly, they're pretty bad. So if we look at what constitutes a good rendering versus a bad rendering, so if we look at this rendering here, what's wrong with it? Well, first off, there's no plants, right? So there's no landscaping at all, and so this person, when they rendered it, they just kind of just plunked the camera down. Didn't take too much attention to landscaping or putting in any plants or putting in any of the other things that really help to make our renders look realistic. Again, if we look at some of these other samples here that are, admittedly not good, look at the camera placement. So the camera is placed high enough that we see the gray default background that Revit provides in your renders for the horizon line if you don't have anything to obscure it. So there's going to be a few tricks that we'll talk about tonight that will help to provide better rendering quality than what you see here. So when you are setting up a render on your own, so I'm just going to open up the advanced or the basic sample project from Revit here. And we've got a folder here of all the different 3D views. So typically when we do a rendering in Revit, we're going to render an exterior view, and we'll use a camera view which we will render. So if we want to place a camera someplace for a rendering to begin, if you go to your site plan or one of your floor plans, you go and find from the 3D menu, find the camera tool. And so the first click places the camera where you want it, and then the second click, of course, indicates both the direction and the depth of the view that you want for your camera. Now, once the camera is placed, we can start doing some targeting with the camera so that we can fine-tune where the camera is located and where the camera is looking. So I'm just going to turn on shaded mode here. If we wish to include a little bit more of a greater field of view here to go a little bit more wide angle on our view, of course we just grab those drag handles on the crop region and stretch them to suit. Now, in terms of where the camera is located and which direction it's looking, let's use the steering wheel for that. So Shift W brings up the steering wheel. And so if I want to adjust the targeting of my view, I can use things like the pan tool to slightly slide my camera from side to side. And maybe if I want to elevate it slightly, so I'm looking a little bit more down on the project, or if I want to lower myself, so I'm just, obviously not below the ground, but just above the ground, I find that I use the pan tool a lot for helping to relocate my camera. The other tool that I'll use quite frequently is the look tool. So again, with the steering wheel enabled, I use the look tool so that I can control which direction my camera is looking. We also have the walk tool, and I should warn you, the walk tool is wicked fast. So what I like to do before I even use the walk tool is in the steering wheel in the bottom right corner, there's that little down arrow that will allow me to access the options dialog box. And so here in the options dialog box, I'll take my walk tool speed and make it as slow as possible. So now if I want to move a little bit closer to the building, so just click on the walk tool and then move a few pixels up so I can walk towards the building, or drag downwards on my screen and back the camera up. So in that way you can fine-tune how far away from the building that you are. There's also the zoom tool, which kind of does the same thing, but it also is adjusting the field of view. So I'm actually going to sort of more of a telephoto mode with this. And then here I'm using a little bit more of a wide angle mode. So between those different settings, you can play with the camera's location until you get the camera into a position that you like. A couple things here. Once the rendering is done, or not the rendering, but the camera location, pay attention to the verticality of the vertical lines in your model. And you can see how they're all kind of spreading outwards. They're converging as we look upwards. And that usually means that you do not have the camera centered on the model. So what that means is you really need to use the look tool and point the camera down a little bit or up to try and get those vertical lines on our walls more or less non-converging. So once that's been completed, you can click on the crop region and adjust the crop region up and down to frame the camera as you see fit. Once you've got your camera more or less placed the way you want, in the steering wheel, in that menu, choose, where is it here, Save View. And what this does is it will save the camera's location so that the next time you open the view, this exact location of the camera will be saved. So in terms of what it takes to make a good render, it's also about planting. So we talked about that. So you need planting to really kind of sell the realism of your project. You want to provide an amount of detail that sort of makes the building look finished without, spending an inordinate amount of time on the modeling process. And another thing that you can do to help speed things up as the rendering is going on is to turn off categories that we can't see. So in this case, something like plumbing. So here you can see there's a sink inside there, but are we really going to notice if the sink is turned off in this render? We're probably not going to notice that. And this will also turn off our toilets and other plumbing fixtures that obviously will have a bit of a significant impact on the amount of time it takes for the render to complete. So sometimes in exterior views, people will turn off entire work sets so that there's whole parts of the building inside that will be hidden while the rendering is going on. Let's flip over to the next page here. Maybe just before we do that, one of the things here to talk about is entourage. And when we say entourage, that is things like people. So this object that you see here is an entourage object. It's actually a person. So here, if I zoom in a little bit and turn on realistic mode, so there you go. So that's one of our realistic objects here. So this thing will appear in the render. So it's nice to provide a few humans in the view. It just helps to give the drawing a sense of scale. If we look down in the kitchen, you can see that they have the cups and plates and chairs. And so for an interior render, providing that amount of modeling on the inside really helps to sell the render and make it look more realistic. So that entourage, as they call it, is great stuff for helping to sell your rendering and make it look real. Now, once the render is complete, don't think that you are finished. There's a lot of great things that you can do in Photoshop once the render is complete. And by the way, if you don't have Photoshop and you wish you did for doing some of the stuff that we're talking about tonight, there is an open source image editor called GIMP. And so GIMP is like a freeware Photoshop. It's not quite as complicated as Photoshop, but it allows you to create layers and allows you to put in your own background in a render and all that good stuff. So some of the tricks that are done in Revit renders is to add some stuff in that it didn't make sense to render in the first place. So let me talk about what I mean about that. Now I'm just looking here for some images which describe the process that I'm talking about here. In particular, I'm looking for renders where extra people have been added to the rendering after the fact. Now, I was just looking at this earlier, and my search results are different than what I had earlier. There was a project in the Middle East that was rendered, and it had exactly what I was looking for here. No, those are using the Revit RPC object. So this is a rendering trick that's often used. So what this requires is for you to use a program like GIMP or Photoshop, and after the render is complete, to add in GIMP or Photoshop some extra imagery that you have downloaded prior. Now, I'm just going to give you a sample of this. I'm going to do a search for people PNG. So, if you do a search for something like people PNG or cars PNG, there are tons of images that you can get on the internet of pictures of just ordinary people, but they're transparent. So if you look on my screen here, you can see that this couple that we have here are on a checkerboard background. So that means that someone has very carefully in Photoshop clipped away all of the background that used to be around these people and has removed it. So now if you were to add this as a layer on top of your Revit render, these people will appear transparent. And we'll give a demonstration of that in a few moments. So there'll be all kinds of different pictures here. So you can see that checkerboard background, that means that these people are on a transparent background and can be added to your render. And the little spaces between their legs and their armpits and all that stuff, that will all allow the Revit rendering in the background to come through. Just a moment here, folks. I need to give Henry the link to our meeting. All right, just going to email Henry here and we'll carry on. Okay, so what I do is I keep a directory of all of these PNGs that I have downloaded on my computer to use when I have completed the rendering. So again, we'll look at this in a few moments. So some other things that I've done over time is I've also downloaded my own backgrounds so that I don't have to use Revit's default rendering background. So if we look at some of these renders here that are kind of boring, this sky background, I can tell you straight away, that is the default Revit rendering background, whereas this Revit rendering, that's someone's own photograph of a sky in the background, and they've put that behind the Revit rendering. So even this one here, this is the same building that you and I are looking at right now. But what they've done is they have put their own picture in the background, and it looks like they've used a different rendering engine as well. So that can be some of the ways that you can really improve the final quality of your render. So along with people, don't forget you can also find trees. So if we look for trees here, Revit's got a sort of a finite library in terms of plants that are being used. And so if you just get onto Google or DuckDuckGo and look for trees, PNG, you'll find that there are tons of different transparent PNG graphic trees that you can download. So I'm just going to save this as it's on my desktop. And I'm going to go back and download a couple of those people here. And I'll see if I can get some people from the foreground here. So I'm going to go ahead and use those in a few moments. All right, so let's get into doing a rendering here. So we've got this rendering here that I've got started. And so we're just going to talk about how you set up the rendering in the first place. So from the intro course, we talked about the basics of rendering. And one of the first things that you have to decide when you are making your render is what's the final size that you need in terms of a physical image that you are printing. Is it going to be 8 inches wide or 10 inches wide or 20 inches wide? Or is it going to be larger than that and say going on a poster? So most times people are trying to print something on a letter size sheet. So if you imagine an image that's going to be 10 inches wide on that 11-inch sheet, typically the resolution that we shoot for is 300 dots per inch. So 10 inches times 300 dots per inch. That means we're looking for a rendering that's about 3,000 pixels wide. So when you are in the render dialog box, you can see the size of the render that Revit is proposing. So here it's 929 pixels, and that's a little bit low. So really we need to get a lot more pixels than that. So what you need to do is switch your render mode to printer. So already you can see we're getting a little bit of a jump. And so if we can either choose one of the sets for the dots per inch, or if you want, you can manually type in a number yourself and hit enter, and Revit will do the math in terms of how many pixels we get. Now, here you can see we've got a width of 202 millimeters. Where is that coming from? Well, before you do the render, a useful thing to do is to click on the crop region for the render and go up to the size crop button. So what this affects is how big this image would be if you were to drop it onto a sheet. So if we're looking at, say, our title sheet here, they've already got a rendering on here, a completed rendering. But if we were to get a new blank sheet here and drag this new view onto a sheet, so you can see, it's got a certain size when it's placed onto the sheet. How can we make it bigger or smaller when we print it? So when we are looking at the view, when you click the crop region, you'll see the size crop button appear on the ribbon. So click on that. And what we want to do here is not change the field of view. So if we were to make the width, 300 millimeters, say for a 12-inch wide render, or 250 millimeters for a 10-inch wide render, we want to switch to scale mode so that it makes the whole image physically bigger or smaller. If we just choose field of view, what Revit will basically do is drag those little dots or the drag handles out or in and basically turn it into more of a wide angle view. So if I forget to change to scale mode, this is what happens. It simply moves those crop dots outwards. And that's not what I want. I want my image to retain these proportions, but I want to simply make it so that it prints at a larger size. Now, it doesn't really look like anything's happened, but if we go and look at our sheet, that's the size that the image is now. This is the size that it was before. So you can see that the image has, in fact, gotten larger. So, based on the width of the image, so here we've got a 10-inch wide image, actually 254 millimeters would be 10 inches, but whatever, so approximately 10 inches wide. Then when we go into the render dialog box, Revit multiplies the physical size of the image that we have chosen by the number of dots per inch that we asked for. So here you can see we are at 2,953 pixels. Now, after this, it's a matter of kind of deciding how we want the render to appear. So we found that the sweet spot for renders is high. The difference between high and best isn't anything that you can really see on the screen, but the best mode certainly takes a lot more time to complete. So we kind of recommend that you use high as a maximum setting. And if you go into medium or draft, you might notice some speckles, which happen on the render at lower quality. So high is kind of a good target in terms of quality. All right, so the next thing to talk about here are the schemes. And there's a few of them, 3 exterior schemes and 3 interior schemes. And it has to do with how Revit displays light that is emanating from electric lights, powered lights in your model. And it has to do with the dynamic range that Revit uses when it does the rendering. So as soon as you enable artificial lights, Revit has to expand the dynamic range of the image so that the weaker light that emanates from light fixtures can appear in the renders. So generally speaking, the use of artificial lights should only be done when it's dark or at dusk. So only very early morning or very late night renders, that's the only time where I would use the sun and artificial to allow my exterior lights to show. So on a summer night, even if I did a rendering at like 7 p.m., my lights are basically going to get washed out. So it's not going to be a very effective render. The same goes for the interior. So if you are doing a daylight render, if you engage artificial lights, you get that increase in dynamic range so that those artificial lights can appear. You just have to be careful that the sunlight doesn't wash out your rendering and overexpose it. So once you've chosen the scheme that you want to use, now we have to talk about here, so if you want to flip over to page 3 in the notes, is dealing with the sun setting. So that is the date and time and the geographic location of the project. So to enter the sun settings here, we've got to go into the sun settings menu, which is this little blue button here on the side. So you've got a few different modes here. What we're really talking about here is doing a still render. And so that requires that we choose a location, date, and time for the render. So Revit is developed near Boston, Massachusetts. So that's the default geographic location that's chosen in the architectural template. So if we want to do a summer render here, so there's your June 21st. If you want to do, say, maybe a noon render here, so I'll do 12 p.m., type the time in, and now I'm going to change our location. So here, I'm going to switch from Boston, hit the little dialog box here to pull up the location of the project. There's a couple of different methods by which you can change your project's location. One of them in the Internet Mapping Surface, you can type in location. So here I'll do Surrey, and we'll see if it'll find it here. Surrey, BC. So there's our project location, that little red house icon, and I can pan the, I can move the icon, drag it to a new location, and pan my view as a result. So that's one way that you can choose a location, so you can see the latitude and longitude is provided here. So Internet Mapping Service, that's one mode. The other mode is your city list. So here we can just go down and look for Vancouver, BC. I have to be honest, this is just the way I do it. It's easier. I'm not having to deal with a map. And then as well, of course, we want to indicate that we're using daylight saving time, which will provide the accurate location of the sun. So question is about where the rendering window is. Down on the bottom of the screen, if you are in a camera view, and you have to be in a camera view, then you will have, where is it here? It's a little teapot with a light bulb beside it. You can also go to the View tab, and there's the render button right there. Okay, so it looks like, let me know if you found it there, Erna, and we'll keep going here. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the dialog box here for the sun settings. And I'm going to pull the trigger on this thing. So away we go. Okay, and render. Now Revit is definitely not the fastest rendering engine on the block. For some of your offices, if you have 3D Studio, 3D Studio Max, Revit exports a file format, FBX file format, very nicely, and I do believe that 3D Studio also directly imports the Revit models now. So I understand that 3D Studio renders many times faster than Revit does, with better results as well. But it is a pretty complicated piece of software, and to be honest, the quality that you can get out of Revit is really quite good. So what we're going to do here, folks, is we're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to just let this Revit render finish to a sufficient quality so that we can export it out, show you how we can work with it in GIMP, and do some layering with some people and some trees on top of the render. So go ahead and take a break, give yourself a coffee, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.